So, begin with a little bit of a story. It was almost 30 years ago. I was in Jerusalem on my year in Israel. It was a Shabbat night. I had made my way down with a few friends to the hotel, kind of just to see the scene there, see what it was like. It was not my first visit to the hotel, but it was my first visit there on a Shabbat. And as such things happen, the friend group splinters a little bit, and I was left sitting with one particular friend having one of those great chats that marks the start of a nice friendship. And in the entire time we were sitting there, and it had to have been at least an hour, there were a group of men. They weren't fully in the men's section, but they were just behind the men's section of the hotel. For those who have been there, you can picture it. Singing. And they were singing this song. Oh, hold on. Which is now being blocked by the recording. Alright, and there's a typo. This word should be gesher, not geher. Just noticed it. So they were singing this song without guitar. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher sar me'od, gesher sar me'od, gesher sar me'od. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher sar me'od, gesher sar me'od. Ve'ha'ikar, ve'ha'ikar, lo lefached klal. Ve'ha'ikar, ve'ha'ikar, lo lefached klal. Then it goes into yalas. Yai lai lai lai, ya lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai, ya lai lai lai, ya lai lai lai, yai lai lai. The whole world is a very narrow bridge. The main thing is to not be afraid. So, the thing is, I knew the song. Several of you know the song. I knew the song. I was very familiar with the song by that time. And it's a saying by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who we're going to look at today a little bit more in depth. And it's a sign of how this small sect, as we'll see, of Hasidism eventually reached out and influenced the entire Jewish world. I knew the song because of my years in Nifty, the Reform Movement Youth Group. We'd sing that song on Friday nights. They knew the song because they had learned it through their tradition. And as we'll learn, the people standing there dancing were unlikely to have been descendants of Breslavian families, but they'd come into it. And even as recently as this summer, at camp, we were singing this song. So it's a common saying, a well-known saying, but it's an example of how the influence of Rabbi Nachman has really come into play. Oh, come on. There we go. So are those of you online able to hear me okay? Yes. Great. Just want to make sure. So tonight we look at Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Is there anyone who wasn't here last time? Anyone online?
I watched a recording.
Okay, so I'm going to just do a brief review then of what you kind of did last week to make sure everyone's on that same page. So, Hasidut, spiritual movement of Judaism, arose in 18th century Europe and is a varied and diverse community today with different sects and dynasties and methods going about it. An attachment to a charismatic leading figure, the Rabbi. Emphasis on doing mitzvot with joy. the idea of simple faith, more inwardly focus on Jewish mysticism, and the idea that the personal, individual action, faith, and practice can bring forth the Messiah. So it arose, as a reminder, out of the period in which it came. We had, starting in 1648, the Chmielnicki pogroms, and yes, I didn't copy these directly from Rabbi Axer, by the way, throughout Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and other places. Estimates of the death toll range wildly from 20 to 100,000. I've even heard up to 250,000. And between the destruction of the Second Temple and the Holocaust, this was the greatest tragedy to befall the Jews, of all the many tragedies that befell the Jews. In response to that, there was a strain of Messianism, Shabbatai Tzvi, who was shown to eventually be a fraudulent Messiah, but his movement influenced others, including Jacob Frank, right in the same time as the Baal Shem Tov. So the Baal Shem Tov, if I summarize this, hold on, what did I just do? I did something in my computer. All right. The Baal Shem Tov focuses on that Lurianic idea coming out of Sfat in the 15th century of Shavirat HaKelim, that our job is to pick up the pieces of these broken vessels that held the light of creation, and restore these holy sparks for the sake of personal salvation, not necessarily bring messianic salvation. The messianic salvation came in with Hasidism. So the core pieces are Dvikut, adhesion to God, opposition to aesthetic practices, meaning excessive fasting, abstinence, abstinence from wine as well. So all of those things, they oppose that. Ecstatic prayer, similar to what we just sang, as you can imagine, over the course of an hour. And they started right around when we got there and continued well after we left. We heard the singing as we made our way up the steps toward the Armenian Quarter. So that sense of ecstatic singing, of singing the same thing over and over and over again, to whip yourself into a frenzy of sorts. And then the idea of, and these things were not common practice in Judaism back then, the idea of Torah study for its own sake, not just to find a legal ruling, but to just learn Torah, and the devotional joy, simcha, that at all times we should be joyful to serve God, and all future Hasidic thoughts rests on these pillars in various ways. Hold on. Excuse me. So, there we go. Now we get to my stuff. Now, I'm not 100% sure, well, I'm 100% sure this is not a photograph of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, because he passed in 1910, as we'll see, as we can already see. 1810, I mean. The first photograph of sorts was sometime in the 1820s, 1830s, and certainly wasn't in the Hasidic communities of Ukraine. So this may be a picture of a portrait, this may be a picture of someone who was pretending to be him. I wasn't entirely able to figure out what this picture was, but the sources I found suggested it is likely him. So, as you can see, he was born in Mezhvede, Ukraine, great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov on his mother's side via his daughter and his granddaughter, and the grandson of the best disciple Nachman of Horodenka on his father's side. So he was of two very, obviously, the most prominent Hasidic family, that of the Baal Shem Tov himself, and of one of the Baal Shem Tov's top disciples. From a young age, he knew that he was supposed to become a tzaddik, that he had these grand, lofty expectations upon him, and he took those on. He married at the age of 14, betrothed literally right after his bar mitzvah, after he became bar mitzvah, and went, as was common in the time, to live at his father-in-law's home in a small rural village called Osatain. And it's a village that has been lost. And during this time, he would often wander in the fields and caves and forests of the area, which helped him develop that sense of of satisfaction and joy within seclusion and within nature that marked much of his work and his teachings. So eventually his widower father-in-law remarried to someone who Nachman did not find pleasant. So he moved to a town called Medvedevka, left there briefly to go to Eretz Yisrael, and will involve some crazy stories of him acting very much not like a tzaddik at times, kind of joking around and teasing with the other passengers. And eventually, on his way home, he accidentally boarded a Turkish warship. Yeah, and they didn't like that, and had to be ransomed to escape from that situation. And it's really after this trip to Eretz Yisrael, which was not a common thing to do in that time, but more common than we realize. Definitely more common than we realize, especially someone from a prominent family who has some money. There's no evidence that he was poor in any way. So it was more common than we realized, but not super common at that time, because of course there were certain dangers of that trip, like boarding a Turkish military ship. They weren't so clearly marked back in those days. What was that?
It was next to the cruise ship.
Yeah, I guess so. So it's but there were definite dangers of that, even within the land itself. But it was after this trip that he really stepped into a greater leadership role. But he was a bit of a challenging personality. He had disputes with other Hasidic leaders in the area, but instead of seeing them purely as disputes, he saw them as an opportunity to grow and to find new paths of Judaism. So while he seemed to revel in these disputes, others didn't feel quite the same way. These disputes affected his ability to maintain a sizable congregation around him. Many went away just either sick of the disputes or deciding they agreed with the other rabbi, and definitely did not make him many friends. The fact is, he saw himself as the Gadol, the greatest of his generation, maybe the greatest of all generations. Humble he was not. So with his dwindling congregation, he moved to Breslov, and a rabbi by the name of Nathan Steinhartz became his disciple and his scribe. Nathan plays an extremely important role in making sure that the work of Rabbi Nachman has been preserved to this day. When we get to the conclusion, we'll see a little how that happened. Nachman of Breslov in his not so older years was very ill, and that put him in contact with Jews in Kiev, in particular, and Kiev was one of the centers of Haskalah, of Enlightenment Judaism, Jews who stepped out of the purely Jewish world, mixed with Gentiles, learned secular subjects, including medicine. So as he went there, he did not resent these Jews, but instead he talked to them, he worked with them, he tried to teach them. And according to Breslavian tradition, he would have returned them to traditional living had he not died young. Whether that's actually true or not, it's hard to say. One in particular that he worked with went on to become a professor of Oriental languages at Cambridge. So these were very cream of the crop. Some of these were very cream of the crop scholars, doctors, others. So he moved to the town of Uman, which becomes significant, near the end of his life, knowing that he was not going to have many years ahead of him. And he hoped that being buried in the Jewish cemetery there, where victims of one of the many Chmielnicki massacres were laid, he hoped that by being there he'd bring further sanctity to the death of all of those individuals. Excuse me. So by doing that, in some ways, it's a very narcissistic idea. Oh, if I'm buried among these people, they'll be better in heaven. But in other ways, that cemetery, despite all that has happened, has been somewhat preserved. And people go there and visit those graves, as we'll see, on an annual basis. During Sukkot in 1810, he died, and then he succumbed ultimately to his tuberculosis at a fairly young age of 38. But he did leave behind children and disciples and so many others.
This picture looks like a lot older than 38, don't you think?
People aged back then.
Okay.
Yeah, like
If you watch old sports videos, it's like, oh, that person's only 35? Yes?
When you say you saw the disputes as chances for growth, did he see them as chances for him to grow or for other people to grow?
He saw it as chances for his own understanding of Judaism to grow, and to bring people along with him on that journey. So, obviously many others did not quite agree with him. So just to kind of review his journeys a little bit, because I'm a very map-oriented person, you can see in this corner in the upper left for those online, that's kind of a zoomed out view of the route that he took around. You can see it kind of in the context of Belarus, Moscow, all the way at that top. You can't see the English word, but in Russian I'm told that says Moscow. But where he is in Eastern Europe, and then a little bit more closely. The best way I could figure out how to do this was with Google Maps direction, and getting directions from one town to the next. So we basically started here in Mitshaveh, and then continued around. Eventually, Smila is where the town of his father-in-law is thought to have been, in the current Ukrainian town of Smila. Then he went all the way to Medvedeva, and then eventually back down to Breslov. So he kind of made this a big circle. And just to get a sense of the context, this circle is 16 hours and 37 minutes. Today that would be a drive from here to Kansas City, more or less, depending on how fast you go on 70. Slow down in Indiana. That's definitely personal experience.
Yeah, good. Yes.
So that gives you just a picture of where he was. His circle was, on a grand scale, fairly small, covered a decent amount of the Ukraine, but still a somewhat small circle in which he lived his life, all in the kind of general district of Kiev, some of it a little bit closer than others.
Rabbi,
Was he on the map?
Excuse me. Yes.
were he and his followers, were they labeled as Hasids in this point in time? Or
Yes.
is this did they name themselves, or did the other Jews name them?
So I'm not sure exactly how the term, I believe that is the term Baal Shem Tov used to describe his followers.
Okay.
So they would have known themselves as Hasids and Tzaddikim.
Okay.
Hasids being led by their Tzaddikim. So that was self-identified. I don't think their opponents would have labeled them as Hasids, because that means righteous ones, or
Right.
pious ones. In this time period too, and I don't know if Rabbi actually went into it at all, but there were a lot of very vicious polemics against the Hasidim. The other side became known as the Mitnagdim, which means opposers, or they'd rather be called Misnagdim, with the proper Ashkenazi pronunciation. And this group was led in particular by the Vilna Gaon. So one of the great scholars and legal minds of this time period. So there were bitter polemics back and forth, especially in the late 18th, early 19th century. And some of them, if you read them, they're basically calling each other non-Jews and heretics and all sorts of nastiness. But something also happened that caused that to simmer down. That was the beginnings of Reform Judaism, which both of them hated. So they found a way to be in a tenuous peace with one another by middle to end of the 19th century. Yes.
What did they disagree about? Was it just a conflict of personalities, or was there something?
It really goes back to, I'm going to go back here. Oops. It really goes back to these ideas of the Baal Shem Tov. Not necessarily did they coot, but the Mitnagdim had a lot more aesthetic practices at times, but in particular, the idea of this ecstatic prayer and the Torah study just for the sake of Torah study. The method of prayer, and interestingly enough, the Reform movement started as a different method of prayer. But the ecstatic prayer in particular, the singing, the clapping, the lying, none of this existed within Judaism prior to that, as far as we can tell. Certainly there were music, there were songs, but this level of where you just go, ya la la la, ya la la la, for an hour and a half on Shabbat night, just simply didn't exist. And it was seen as, at times, heretical, at times frivolous, and at times even copying the manner of the nations. Yeah, Alex?
What was the attraction of that practice? All that lie for an hour and a half. I mean, there are those of us who are totally turned off by that.
Right.
And for other people, there is meaning found in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't understand it.
Right, so I think for many who are able to get into that, there's a meditative aspect to it. There's, when I was talking about those Hasids in the Western Wall Plaza, they were just whipping themselves into an ecstasy that I think if I had gone up and tapped one of them on the shoulder, they would have had to snap out of whatever trance they had put themselves in. And so I think there's an attraction to both that sense of ecstasy of finding that connection to God and seeing, people who follow this see that as a way of connecting to God, and also the approach of joy. Yeshivas, cheders, yeshivas in the early modern period before Hasidism and even after were not joyful places. They did it because that's what they did. That's what Jews did. And there was no way out of doing that. So the Hasidim much more influenced and brought in a sense of joy. And some of the arguments of Mitnagdim were, how can we feel joy when the temple is destroyed? And while the Hasidim never eliminated any prayers and certainly even intensified prayers for the temple to be rebuilt, they took a little bit of an approach that it was almost 2,000 years ago. We can still experience joy. Even without them, we can't experience the greatest of joy until the temple is built. But we can still experience joy within our world, and we should approach God with joy. I think there's a line in Psalms, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. Go in and connect to God through joy. So that's a lot of what they hook their ideas on, and a lot of what the establishment, so to speak, was very much against.
So were they the ones that created the Nigunim?
Nigunim definitely comes out of Hasidic culture, not just Breslavians, but others as well. Nigunim very much so come out of Hasidic culture. Were there melodies without words before that? Of course. But the idea of a nigun as a specific thing that is within Judaism very much comes out of the Hasidic culture. And just another example of how that has spread, I just finished the 6-seminar course where I went 6 times to Skokie and learned with other Jewish educators of all different types. And each one is framed by a nigun. We had a nigun for each of our 6 seminars. So something that's really continued to influence Judaism. So moving forward a little bit, we get to some of the works of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. So when his son was born, he was convinced that this was a holy child. First, when his daughter was born, he was convinced that she would be the mother of the Messiah. But then he had a son and became convinced that he indeed was this holy child. But his son died as an infant, which was, of course, not uncommon in those days. And in some ways, it changed him. It broke, I wouldn't say it broke his faith entirely, but it affected how he thought about messianism, how he thought about joy, how he thought about teaching. So he wrote this book, or scroll really, it was an actual scroll, called Megillat Setarim. And it's written almost entirely in hints and acronyms. So that if someone just randomly picked it up, they'd have no idea what was being said. And the idea was that only one individual per generation was allowed to understand it. Connecting a little bit to the idea of the priesthood, that one priest knew that secret name of God, handed it down to the next priest before his death, and it kept getting handed down. So basically one person of each generation would eventually teach the next someone in the next generation that would be deemed worthy. It was thought to have been completely lost to history. And in the early 21st century, it was discovered by a scholar and was found scattered between different book collectors. But the scholar was able to authenticate it, brought it to some Breslavian Hasids, who were able to say, yes, this is what it is, and they even taught him how to read it. So it's a vision of a messianic age, and portrays Nachman in near messianic terms, but at the same time shaken by the loss of his son. You can imagine that a man who feels as deeply as he does, going off in nature on his own, getting into ecstatic prayer, that something like that would affect him, even as unfortunately commonplace as it was in those days. So what makes it interesting is this vision of messianic age is not some giant upheaval. It's not big wars and cataclysms and Armageddon and all the things we see in some Jewish, but often more so Christian literature about the time of the Messiah. But he really was more in line with the rationalism of Maimonides, which is an interesting juxtaposition, because so much of Hasidic practice was non-rational. To sit there and sing for an hour, you have to let go of rationality. So that it wasn't this big upheaval, but rather a better version of the status quo for everyone. So much more rationalist idea. So Rabbi Nachman's major work, though, that became widespread shortly after his lifetime, is called Sipurei Hamarayot, the Tales of Rabbi Nachman. That's this book. This is not an original printing. Obviously, it's, of course, in English. And we're going to get a chance to look at some of this in a little bit. But as you can see, it is a unique thing in Hasidic literature, because most Hasidic literature are stories about the rabbis. These are not necessarily about Nachman. He puts himself in here and there. But they're not really about Nachman. They're allegories, princesses, pirates, and even magic dust. And he saw himself as a Solomonic figure, using riddles and allegories to get to the idea of a story. And these stories got this level of sacredness attributed to them by his followers. Similar level of sacredness to the Zohar, which is the core Kabbalistic text, and the teachings of Isaac Luria. And within the time of following Nachman's death, only members of the Breslavian sect were allowed to tell those stories. Others could hear, but only those who were fully within the group were ever allowed to tell the stories. So when it goes, scholars have deduced there's kind of some theories to how he tells a story, of how he understands a story. And this is taken from other writings of his, that there are hidden truths in all tales of all peoples, like the sparks of holy creation, which is a really pluralistic thought for him to have at that time. That there's truths, the stories everyone tells has their truths, but similar to the breaking of vessels, that original meaning of these stories has been lost over time. So someone who is properly inspired like the Besht, like Rabbi Nachman, can reveal the holiness of stories through that sense of retelling. And this repaired story that has theological and spiritual values. The story from a true tzaddik will awaken sleepers from their slumber. Will alert someone to a truth and will necessarily affect them in how they live their lives. Any questions at this point? Just doing a time check. Good. So, what we're going to do is something a little different. There we go. We're going to explore 3 of the shorter stories in this book. One called The Rabbi's Son, one called The King Who Decreed Conversion, and one called The Loss of the Princess. For those of you in this room, I'm going to divide you into, I think, just 3 groups, one for each story. You'll each have a copy of the story. For those of you online, once I get things going here in this room, I will divide you into groups online and share a digital version of the story with each group so that you can then discuss. So what I'm going to do first is put our participants, our online participants, we have to stop the share, hold on, into breakout rooms. So those of you who are online, go into breakout rooms, introduce yourself to each other, chat, and I will, in a few minutes, I will be there in your room. Oh wait, before I do that, hold on, I forgot. I want to go over the questions to consider as you read. Those of you who are in this room, this list will stay up. Those of you who are not, I'll try to post the questions in the chat of your breakout group. But what we're considering are a few different things as we read the story. And I'll encourage you kind of move chairs around the room so that you can read it out loud to one another. Stories are an oral tradition. So take the time to kind of separate your chairs, move them around a bit, and introduce yourselves if you don't know each other, but also take the time to read it out loud, paragraph by paragraph. And as you're reading, think about, and then ultimately you'll discuss these questions. What is happening in the story? Some of these stories are a little confusing. In what way was the conclusion satisfying or not satisfying? Not all of these stories come to a full conclusion. What hidden truths was Nachman trying to reveal in telling the story? And finally, what might be the theological or spiritual value to someone hearing this story? So we've got our online individuals here. I'm going to actually stop the share so we can see everyone.
I hope I said that politely.
Come on. I'm working 3 computers at the same time here.
Who's the last one?
All right. So I'm hoping the owl will follow me. Sort of is. So let's come back together, and you can turn your chairs however makes you comfortable. And if someone from each group can share, just in a very brief way, about the story, which story you read, and 1 or 2 insights that you gained from that. So let's start with the online groups. We'll give them first shot. The group that had the Rabbi's Son.
That's us, me.
All right.
So you want some insights of what we learned?
Yes.
Well, one thing that was talked about was about being an overprotective father, the dangers of that, even though you only have one son. So in the story, there was a rabbi that only had one son who was studying Torah all the time. And he kept feeling like something was not right, so he kept wanting to go meet with his tzedek, and the father was objecting. And there's more to it. But anyways, so the other thing that I saw in it was that the son was studying alone all the time, and that was, contrary to the joy of the Hasidic way, and that was part of the story. And This might not have been intended, but the father kept saying that we'll go on this journey, but if anything goes wrong, that means that we're not supposed to be making the journey, so we'll turn around. And I thought it's not very realistic that life is gonna go perfectly well, and if we stop every time something goes wrong, we will not get very far.
Great.
So those were my thoughts. And the son did die at the end, so it obviously didn't go very well.
No. All right, so we'll continue with the online groups. King who decreed conversion. Any volunteers from that group? If not, that's okay. We've got an in-person group too. Anyone from the Loss of the Princess want to go?
I can talk. This is Suzanne Katzen. So we all did not find the ending satisfying or the whole story satisfying, but it was basically about a king who put a curse on his daughter, on the princess, and my husband Mark pointed out that he had a temper, and that kind of showed that tempers are bad. And then she was lost, and then the viceroy went to go search for her, and she would somehow he found her, but she said he couldn't rescue her unless he did some things like fasting, and it had to be a certain time. And then every time when it got to the time he was supposed to rescue her, he would fall asleep for a number of years. At one point it said it was 70 years he fell asleep. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And then he was wandering and wandering, and he saw giants, and so it was a big long story. And then at the end it said that he did find her, but it seemed like he must have been wandering for over 100 years. And so we got out of it. Persistence is a good thing, but you can't lose your focus and miss what you really need to do. And that the temper and the curse were bad. And I think that's kind of a summary of what we got out of it.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Suzanne. Well done.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I can speak a little to the second one.
All right, the king who decreed conversion.
Yes, the story was basically about being forced to convert. And one of the Jews did convert, but deep in his heart, he basically wanted to be able to practice his Judaism. And he became a minister to several of the kings that were sons of the king before. And when he had a chance, he got favor and was allowed to practice his faith. But even when the son denied him, he still was the best person that he could be. And so we thought that the lesson of the whole story was that you live the Torah throughout the generations. It was all about Torah, not so much what was done to you, it's how you act to the world. And he saved, the king was killed in the end, and he was the one that was saved.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you. All right, so now for those of you in the room, and when you talk, just kind of look toward the owl here. I've got it set on so that the people online can see who's talking. So we'll go in the same order. So we start that we actually did. So we'll start the rabbi's son.
So we read the rabbi's son. You've already heard somewhat of a summary. Some of the things we spoke about were the story kept coming back and back about how the son felt incomplete and felt the need to go to the tzaddik in order to complete himself and learn something. And the father kept standing in the way. And we thought that was an important lesson about recognizing your need and fulfilling yourself. And even though you respect and love the father, needing to make sure that you could complete yourself and your mission. And the son clearly understood something his father didn't about why he had to go to the tzaddik. The other thing we learned is that the whole thing was engineered by this character named Samael, who we had never heard of, but learned from the rabbi is the king of the demons. And the reason that this was prevented was because the son, who felt this small spark of light but incomplete and needed the tzaddik to complete him, if they had come together, they would have brought about the Messianic age. So that Samael had to stop that. Again, this just went to the whole idea that if you feel that incompleteness in your spirituality and a recognition of what you need to pursue it.
Great, thank you so much. Wonderful, just wonderful interpretations. And I'll mention that I'm going to send an email tomorrow to all the registrants, everyone online and in person, with copies with links to all the stories and the explanations.
Okay.
So you can see them all ultimately. Next, the rabbi's son.
We just did that.
Oh, you were the rabbi's son. Sorry, loss of the princess.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, this was a kind of a confusing story where the princess is in a place that her father terms the not so good place, and she continually wants to be freed from there. And the viceroy of the king goes to find her, and he goes through many travails trying to get to her, and we decided that, like the other group said, he persisted even though he failed. He had to have faith that he could achieve it, and yet it seemed almost impossible because he always failed at the last juncture, at the last day. At the end, he does, with the help of nature, with the winds and stuff, he is able to free the princess and take her back home. The lure of her home is very, it's a goal she wants, and he is able to take her back, but it's like the story just sort of stops because it gets started.
Right, that story does peter out a little bit. And he freed her, but we're not going to tell you how. And I will say that of the three stories, I felt the loss of the princess was the most complex one. Most definitely. And it was the longest as well. All right, so now the king who decreed conversion.
The king who decreed conversion, I guess the recap has already been given. I think we felt that the story, in some of the complications, wasn't clearly satisfying, but I think the intent of it was to be comforting. So it was written as a thing, especially for people in these generations who were probably very familiar with pogroms. It was to encourage them and comfort them to maintain a personal Jewish identity. This was the thing that in the story, the talit and the tefillin, to identify yourself publicly. These are things that make Jews stand out quite a bit. And that it was a combination for Jews to maintain the faith and the observance and I mean, use the word identity. I think that's really the key thing, is to feel that oneself is a Jew, and even if you're somewhat hidden, but to hold on to that and pass that on. And for the nations to say, the ones that are oppressive, yeah, they're going to make life really, they may make life awful for us here, but in the end, eventually those that do that, those nations will not last, will not endure, and the kings that are tolerant of us expressing our identity are the ones that will survive, and through those, as long as we hold on to it somewhere, that will continue to survive.
Great, thank you. And I thought the real powerful imagery in that story was the whole ox and lamb, representing ox representing the leather of the tefillin, and lamb representing the wool of the talit.
Oh, and those oppressive regimes will not understand the lessons. The message will be there, telling them what they need to do, but they won't get it.
Nope. Camera does not seem to want to switch on this computer. Hold on, just a second, a slight, weird technical difficulty going on here. Well, that's not good.
It's not funny.
Zoom was giving me some challenges during the holidays also. Now, are those online still able to hear me?
Yes.
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 Okay. You might not be able to see me. Perhaps the owl will adjust, but I'm going to reshare my screen because I'm still on here. Actually, what I'm going to do is do video on the screen that I'm on. What's going on here? Hold on. Oh, Zoom is in some kind of, there we go. Now you'll at least be able to see me. Thank you everyone for participating in that. I heard really good discussions as I popped into the breakout rooms as I walked around here a bit. They're really deep stories, complex stories that really try to get at the heart of important truths. So I'm going to share my screen again. Anything improve up there? No. So in that case, those of you in the room, I'll encourage you to follow along on the PowerPoint itself, because that has completely melted down. So what became then? We're going to conclude with what became of Bratslavian Hasidism after the death of Rabbi Nachman.
You're back.
I'm back. Oh, we're back. But it's not showing the shared screen, which is weird. All right.
One of those indicators let you go back to using the home.
Yeah, hold on just a second. I'm going to try to fix the technical challenges here. Give it one more try. I don't think I'm that back. All right. We're going to continue forward. And I apologize to those in the room that will not be able to see the screen, but at least you have the handouts. So these are, you can see in your handouts, or on the screen, these are the, this is the grave of Rabbi Nachman and the Beit Midrash that was built beginning after his death. So let me grab my notes here. He didn't have, unlike most Hasidic dynasties, he did not have a true successor. Very similar to Lubavitch Hasidism in the modern day. That there was no true successor to Menachem Mendel Schneerson. But there are others who carried on. So first of all, Rabbi Nathan, who was his scribe and is responsible for what we have in this book, became known as Reb Nosson, took the lead, but he did not consider himself the leader. Reb Nosson established a printing press to publish Nachman's writings and encouraged the continuation of his practices and built a new Beit Midrash in Uman, which is what this building modernized is. Continued disputes did drive some followers away. So they were a small sect. After Reb Nosson's death in 1845, the leadership of Reb Nachman of Tulchin and Rabbi Abraham Hazan, his son, expanded the publication of Nachman's work, but still kept it as a very small sect. Then we get to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Bender. He was Rabbi Abraham's top disciple and took the lead following the death of Rabbi Abraham and led the movement until his own death in 1989. So from the beginning, or no, really more the end of World War I, all the way to the end of the Cold War. You can see a picture of him. This time it is a real photograph. So he expanded the movement. Under his leadership, he expanded the movement initially in Ukraine and Poland. but only a small number survived the Holocaust and the effects of Soviet rule. Hey, you got it back. Here, I'll just go back real quickly, then you can see that in full color. So only a small number of his followers made their way to Israel. Many were lost. So that was between the Holocaust and Soviet rule as well. Where trying to practice Breslov and Hasidism in Uman was not possible. So in the 1970s, though, there was a sudden renewed interest in Rabbi Nachman in Israeli culture, and it started to grow the movement, and Rabbi Bender attracted many students. But even during his life and following his death, the movement was fragmented, but not in a angry way necessarily, just different groups of Breslavians. Today there are Breslavian centers in Mea Shearim, 2 of them, one in the neighborhood and one just outside of the neighborhood. And then there's one in the town of Yavniel in the Galilee, and a center within New York City as well. Most adherents to Breslavian Hasidism today are not those descended from the old Breslavian families. Rather, they are mostly Baalei Teshuvah, the term given to someone who comes from secular Judaism into Orthodoxy. And also they attracted a huge following among Sephardic, Yemenite, and Persian communities as well. So today, Breslavian Hasidism, if you go into a community, there may be more Jews of non-Ashkenazi descent than of Ashkenazi descent, which is interesting for a Hasidic group. So one particular small group became the non-Nachman group, and they spread this phrase that you can see up here. And I've got it on a banner here, in graffiti here. I'm not sure exactly where that picture is from, but the phrase is Nachman mi Uman. Kind of plays on his name from Uman. And they believe that repeating this mantra will help bring about redemption. How? I'm not sure. But by spray painting it everywhere, by holding up banners, people inevitably say the phrase. I've said that phrase more times in my life than I probably should. So it's this small but very influential offshoot. And you'll see if you go to Israel, and many of you have been to Israel, and have probably seen this all over the place. Graffiti, stickers, painted on cars, all sorts of places. And it's an extension of Nachman's idea of mantras, of inner devotion, of saying meaningless phrases to get this sense of ecstasy. Today, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it has been possible once again for Jews to go to Uman in the Ukraine. And even in a time of war for both Israel and Ukraine, Jews have continued going there. These pictures, as best I could determine, are from the past 2 years. The tradition is to go visit on Rosh Hashanah. So they come, they visit for Rosh Hashanah. In the first year of the Ukraine-Russia war, people were warned off not to come. They didn't really listen. But you can see the mass crowds of men. Only the men go, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone. So it attracts tens of thousands and from far beyond the Breslavian communities. So members of other Hasidic sects, other Orthodox Jews, and some just general secular Jews who are curious about the spectacle make their way there every year for Rosh Hashanah. And observe Rosh Hashanah, you can see out on the small lake, crowded, hanging on the arch of that Beit Midrash entrance. So you can see in the back of the picture on the upper right, the Beit Midrash I showed you in the earlier slide. And people are just all over it because it's Rosh Hashanah and if you're Orthodox, you can't do anything else once you're there. So it's not like day one's done and time to go home. They got to stay through at least day 2. So so today, on this day, it's unclear exactly how many Breslovian adherents there actually are. The movement is still somewhat in flux, still adjusting following the death of Rabbi Bender in many ways, and is splintered in many different directions. But all of them connect to Rabbi Nachman and his teachings, and today the teachings and thoughts and ideas of Rabbi Nachman are really spread throughout the Jewish world. So his legacy, his teachings, his melodies, now the melody we sang before and we're going to finish with is not his melody, someone else wrote that. But his words still stay with us today, and that's really some of the power of Rabbi Nachman and why he remains such a fascinating historical figure. Next week, Rabbi Weiss will be here. She will go into Martin Buber, who is a scholar, interpreter, and translator of Hasidic lore, among many, many other things that he was. So it'll be a chance to learn a more modern, scholarly point of view of Hasidism. So,
Rabbi Plotkin.
yes. Oh, we have questions. Before we do that, questions.
Well, there's a story from, I think it's Rabbi Nachman, about someone who goes to the forest and he knows where the,
Oh, yes.
the fire and he knows the prayer and all, and then in the next generation, one of
Right.
those things gets, you know the story, because
So-
it's a favorite one.
I'll tell the story. It's a wonderful, one of the more simple Rabbi Nachman stories. And it's a story of the Baal Shem Tov. About the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov knew to go on a certain day to a certain place, to light a fire in a certain way, and say a certain prayer. And the next generation, they kind of forgot which day it was, but they still went to that certain place to light the fire in a certain way and say the certain prayer. Then the next generation, the words of the prayer were lost, but they would still go to that certain place and light the fire in a certain way. Then they lost how the fire was lit, but they'd still go to the certain place. And eventually they forgot where that certain place was, but continue to tell the story. And that way, the spirit of what the Baal Shem Tov did there still continues to live on because we still tell the story today.
Thank you, that's beautiful.
So we'll conclude once again in a little bit of song. And I apologize, my guitar went out of tune here. Kol haolam kulo gesher tsar meod, gesher tsar meod, gesher tsar meod. Kol haolam kulo gesher tsar meod, gesher tsar meod. V'ha'ikar, v'ha'ikar, lo lepachet, lo lepachet klal. V'ha'ikar, v'ha'ikar, lo lepachet klal. Ya la la la, ya la la la, ya la la, ya la la, ya la 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 la, ya la la la, ya la la la, ya la la. All right, well, thank you for being here, for learning with me together, and I hope you will enjoy next week as well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank
who
you.